we need new models, and they need to be more attendant to the complexity, to the uncertainty, to the dynamism of all the changing parts.
So when we think about being proactive, you look at indigenous areas across the globe, and we manage about 80% of the world's biodiversity on about 25% of the landmass.
So how do you build on the strengths of people and their understanding and their coexistence with nature to address these critical challenges of land degradation, of forest losses and water depletion?
A shift in one part of a social or an ecological setting will have vast repercussions elsewhere.
So we position in our worldviews as look at the whole ecological systems within which human beings are one of the several life forms, and of the several pursuits of human nature, economic progress is only one of them.
So why do we need socio-ecological systems thinking? I think, quite frankly, because other ways of thinking have failed. The dominant growth paradigm at all cost fails ecology, and it fails people. Some people do fantastically well. They make millions and billions of dollars, but the vast majority don't. And obviously it hasn't worked well for our glaciers and other systems.
In certain civilizations, people thought that they were a part of nature, not the master of nature. In certain civilizations, people thought that they were the masters of nature.
So as we think about that in our modern context, it really allows us to have the best of both worlds. It allows us to keep one foot in the circle, right? Where we're practicing the practice of who we are as Blackfeet people and utilizing that to inform everything that we're doing, while living with one foot outside the circle that allows us to really embrace a market-based economy. So when we think about holism, we think about the interdependent functions and relationships in a system. A lot of times from a Western perspective, we take a piece of that system, we research it, and then we try and control it rather than looking at how we utilize natural process to inform what we're doing in a modern context.
You take, for example, as a whole, and what the tribe's doing, with the buffalo program, native plants. The college has done a lot in working with growing some native plants. The elders that we've been around have taught us how to dig these roots, how to use them. And that really doesn't coincide with conservation practices from the Western point of view. So we take what they have, but we also incorporate it into what we do traditionally, right?
Foundation for Ecological Security was basically set up to address the critical challenges facing land degradation, water depletion in the country. And in doing so, what the approach we had taken was to look at the interaction between nature and people. And then in the last few centuries, we also have developed a kind of a property laws which were too centered around individuals and did not look at collective ownership of resources. That was another major trigger that happened. Another important development that probably happened again some 10 centuries ago was the Cartesian thinking of duality, of you and I being separate, the subject-object thing. That separation has brought in probably good advances in scientific thinking, but it did bring in a distance between nature and people. And then we had the scientific method, which only proved one way of looking at things, which is also good for science, but it's not so great in the way all things are interconnected in life, and not everything remains constant forever. So in the last few centuries, what we have is a combination of such thinkings, the property laws, the man-nature divide, put together on a platform where there is an unbridled economic opportunity and without discussions about our responsibility for nature and our responsibility for future generations. So it has triggered off some kind of a runaway machine which has exploited or over-exploited resources, and it was waiting to happen. So the climate crisis that we see today, the water crisis that we see today, or the severe losses of biodiversity were just waiting to happen.
So the idea of community-based conservation, first of all, I think we need to differentiate between efforts that have been pursued by groups on their own. We can call those endogenous. If people are of that place, you can call it indigenous, but they are organic. They've been doing it themselves for forever. Versus those that have been designed, created, oftentimes by outsiders, well-intentioned outsiders, and funded, promoted by NGOs. And they're different. And the fundamental idea of both of these is that that local entity creates the rules, the institutions that govern how access to those resources occurs, the management, the distribution of the products, the benefits of those products, and that there is a loop of feedback system that is local, close to the proximity of that resource and where those people live and make their lifeways. That feedback is very close and very tight, so that when something is wrong in their system, they themselves know it, feel it, and can make the proper adjustments. So the attributes of this condition today, the attributes are paying attention to the complexity, paying attention to the uncertainty of how these trajectories will play out on their own, let alone in combination. So it requires cooperation, it requires connections with other scientists, and it requires connections to people on the ground who have been living and managing these systems. Hence, it requires an openness to what we consider knowledge systems, to what we consider expertise. The 20th century notion of the credentialed scientist that is only an expert because they read a book or got a PhD can no longer suffice. I want to emphasize that having a democratic openness to all these voices is extremely important. And a lot of those voices have been silenced through the model of development that we've followed, which has privileged urban, professionalized, production-oriented systems and peoples and experts, and has allowed not only land grabbing, but resilience grabbing.
The project here at Blackfeet with the buffalo program is the biggest thing that we're doing is returning buffalo back to our lands for our cultural and our spiritual connection to the animal. It's one of the things that's a part of our culture that was taken away from us, and along with many other things. But free roaming animals is what it's about. I always look at it too as the buffalo, they used to take care of us way back in the day in a different way. And then now in this day and age, they can take care of us, again in a new way. Some of the way up to, I think, 600 head, and we're looking at doing some real good marketing along with working with all of the conservation part of it, of bringing them back and taking care of our lands also with the buffalo. We do a lot of things in the area of health. We're trying to get our community back to eating healthy. And buffalo meat is one of the healthiest grass-fed buffalo that is good for us, and then so it's a real health thing, not only body-wise, but a healthy thing, I guess, holistically. But I always talk about how symbolic and how the buffalo are to us, but not only them, all of the other animals, they all, in our way, are a big part of our life and a big part of our religion. These animals mean a whole lot to us. The bear, the wolves, they were a part of this landscape, and they belong here. They were here before all of the other people. So that's kind of the way I see it, is, they're here, and we want to return them and we want to keep them, but we also utilize them and for a healthier lifestyle. So when we started the E&E initiative, and it was with the help of the Wildlife Conservation Society that came in and worked with our department, and along with our college also, that we started the E&E initiative, and got the people involved. And we had a lot of dialogue from elders and young people and on up, and a lot of talk for a few years, and finally got our people to really realizing what we were missing and what we were bringing back.
When you look at the number of animal and plant species that we have on Blackfeet in our little 1.5 million acres, and you compare that to even the state of Montana, which is around 93 million acres, we have 80% of the large vertebrates. We have 8 keystone species, right? And so as you look at that biodiversity and the ability to protect that biodiversity, it's essential that we look at conservation, how we utilize conservation in a modern context to not only be informed and managed by our core values and the practice of who we are as Blackfeet people, but that also allows us to create translational models that then can be duplicated in other areas. So as we think about that correlation, the ability for a tribe to manage its own resources and to prove to dominant culture that not only are we capable of managing these systems, but we've done so for 15,000 years, and you might be able to learn some from our approach as well.
We have the traditional ecological knowledge. We have the astronomy and the stories, the connection to Spumitapiks, Sakumitapiks, Soyitapiks, the sky beings, the earth beings, and the water beings. And so how those relationships evolve, even today, we, like they said, don't talk about things in the past because everything is happening consistently. Just to know that's really encouraging even to our students to be able to say, no, I am a scientist, through the language, through the ceremonies, through knowing the stories and the songs. All of that knowledge that's made up in all those areas really ties back to understanding the place and understanding how we fit into the world and fit into the universe.
And that's the beauty of doing things from a holistic perspective, right? Really understanding and recognizing those interdependent functions and relationships in a larger system. You hear a lot of people talk about a holistic approach, but very few people are doing it because it is so complicated. And I think when we first started out and thought about the challenges around decolonizing, management systems, of course there was resistance, right? But we were successful in bringing enough solution seekers to the table to really examine, best practices, right? To benchmark, things that other tribes and indigenous people were doing around the world, and then take our core values and the practice of who we are and really allow them to manifest in a modern context.
In the way you approach villages directly at the local level, we build on what is already there. They come up with a fantastic range of rules and regulations that they evolved over years or probably decades. So those rules are extended into managing the forests, if at all they do not have any. In many places for pastures and for forests, village people do have rules and regulations. So we don't really need to do anything as an outsider. It is basically whatever are the barriers which are stopping them from doing so. If they're able to address that, we don't have to really take some new forms of wisdom into their systems.
We had 7 of our tribes along here, the Highline, that came together and signed a treaty to work with each other and support each other to return buffalo to our lands, to return them to our heritage, our culture.
Village commons are shared resources like forests, pastures, water bodies, where the ownership belongs to the whole village.
The individuals don't own the animals, the tribe does, and we use them for, you know, all of the tribal members. But along with having them here, it has created jobs, you know, which is pretty tough, you know, here.
So we focused on working on common property or common pool resources and with village communities so that those resources are better managed. The second way of looking at the same problem is about 50 years ago, Garrett Hardin and the tragedy of commons was widely recognized as a great revelation. But in the last 50 years, several scholars have researched on it and found that there are other alternatives to that story, and the tragedy is not inevitable. So instead of relying excessively on what the tragedy of commons was leading us to, of total individualization or a total control by governments, there could be a space where village people can come together as a collective and manage such shared resources.
So the language and the land, they're not separate. And all of the beings and those relationships are described in the language. And so, like I was explaining Awagasi, the deer, and the way he runs, the way he moves, helping you to understand that species and why he moves that way. And then that ties back to his habitat and how he interacts with his habitat. There's these pockets of knowledge that are embedded in the language, and sometimes you don't really connect it all if you're not out on the land. So you really have to be engaged in ceremony and language and outside and in the environment to fully experience that knowledge, and it starts to click. And even with the buffalo, I grew up where we would see 1 or 2 buffalo from the old herd, but it wasn't a common thing. And now to be able to know, fully know, my children and my grandchildren will never know a life without buffalo. That's huge. And what else does that bring? What else is that going to bring to their world? And we're already seeing the impacts. We're seeing, you know, the things that we need for ceremony, the things that we need for the land, the grasses. Those things are all being replenished and used again and part of the life again. And so our kids are going to have that. But I think a lot of the paradigm shift with natives and non-natives is, at what point do we stop boxing it in as integration and look at it as equal knowledge systems? And I think that's where we're pushing now, and that's what our children will have. It won't just be, oh, how do we integrate this? It'll be more of, how do we acknowledge that this learning and this knowledge is important equally.
So as we look at many of the partnerships that we've created, we've reached out to institutions that have really allowed us again to take the lead, right? To take the lead in not only the planning process, but also the implementation process. These types of partnerships give us real opportunity to not only share knowledge, but to also show Western or dominant culture, that not only are indigenous methodologies tried and true, but they're universal, they're across the globe. So land tenure and the ability to manage your own lands becomes extremely important, as you know, right? If you don't have any power over the management of your lands, then you end up becoming a part of the system. And we know, as you look at the other 75% of the globe, right? That's non-indigenous areas. We know the depletion of those resources, and we know the impact impact that people in profitability have had on those spaces. So we get the opportunity to be proactive.
I think one element of why land gets degraded is a strong notion that we all hold that village people are dumb. So they have to be provided certain things and that they're not capable. Basically, it becomes a technical fix rather than an entrepreneurial fix where village people are understood as breeders, as rich knowledge keepers, knowledge archivers of centuries of soil health, of water flows, breeding, of livestock keeping. These knowledge systems are eroded with a mindset which has maximization of profits, of maximization of production as the singular operating value. I think we will have to progress into a world where village people are respected as equal citizens of their own intellect, wherein we realize that it is not just an ecosystem restoration, but alongside that, what are the social systems which need to be strengthened? What are the rules, regulations, roles, responsibilities of village life, which are inherent in the society, which could be challenged further so that they could become more democratic, they could tilt towards the lesser endowed people, but essentially building on this nature and human interactions. Strangely, this scientific thinking that we have brought in or we have learnt in the organization also came from villages. And the villages knew it much. They were leading this kind of an interconnected systems thinking in their day-to-day work. So the science that we brought in was a realization of what is actually existing on the ground, but a kind of science which was neglected, which was probably deliberately neglected with a reductionist thinking. So moving back from that into bringing in a systems thinking, wherein social, ecological, economic, political, all these cause and effects are understood, so that you, by stressing on a couple of the drivers, you are elevating the whole system rather than picking up on one thread or one element in it.
And so I think, as far as conservation and thinking about a lot of the federal agencies or NGOs, they look at one piece of it and say, oh, that's what we're going to work on. We're going to save this species, or we're going to look at just the trees, or we're going to look at just the water. And we don't approach things that way. We look at everything. I think, being able to work with our partners and say, this is how we are going to learn together. And this is what's going to strengthen our partnership, because we can't just look at one thing without noticing everything else around it that helps it to be healthy. And so how do we do that? How do we figure that out together with our partners so that we know how all these things, the different species, work together to make a prosperous environment?
The key to success is just diligence, just sticking with it and going forward. Just like buffalo. They always talk about there's a big storm, they don't turn their butts and go the other way, they turn their head into the storm and they forge on, they go through. So that's what we've done with this program, is it's always a struggle, but we've just stayed with it.